Hey, everybody.
Hi
Justin here.
everyone, Eric here. How's it going?
It's going great, thanks.
It's like there's only one other person in the room right now that
Uh,
can respond to that question.
yes. Um, Reveals, but more about things that have a pretty strong impact on the evolving game industry. Um, yeah. Eric, do you have any better way to summarize it than I just did?
Yeah, I guess so. We look at stories that affect sort of the game industry itself as a whole, as opposed to individual blurbs. There's occasional moments where we'll chime in and say, "Hey, we think this is pretty neat, pretty nifty," and we'll cover it and say why we think so. But in general, we try to focus more on less on individual game news and more on industry-wide news, things
Yep.
that affect the industry and therefore players, as well as because that's all trickling down. Can't affect the game developers without also affecting the players.
Yeah. So if you're into tracking like the latest game industry trends and what's happening on marketing or business levels, that's what we pretty much cover. So we broadcast every 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, or as many times as we can. We're on our 63rd episode. Yay, us. Uh, let's see here. What else is there? You can catch us on YouTube, and only YouTube at this point, at youtube.com/sonicbloomtv. And all the past episodes are also on our channel, so if you want to check those out, they're there for you too.
Yeah.
Um, so let's get into covering the news. Let's see. What latest news topics do we have this week?
We're going to cover three news topics this week. We're going to go over Microsoft has announced some of its well has not an announcement so much as revealed
Yeah,
their
forcefully.
yeah, yep. They revealed some of their Game Pass successes in terms of how much revenue a subsegment of Game Pass has made over the past year or so. It's unclear exactly the window, but they revealed some numbers. We're going to look at those numbers and discuss what that might mean. It's sort of related to our third story, which I will skip down to in because of that sort of segue. I'll skip into that and say that you know the uh, we all know now that Microsoft has put in a bid to buy Activision Blizzard, Activision Blizzard King, actually, but the that larger company for the purchase price is somewhere on the order of 63
$69 billion, I think.
billion. Yeah, I think you're right, 69 billion. Huge deal. But there are significant concerns across the globe about the impact on the industry and what that's going to mean for competition in the market. And the EU in particular, along with some of the states internally, actually, no, I'm sorry, the EU and now also the UK, which is no longer part of the EU, have both come out with either statements or questionnaires to send to people about what is the perceived impact and to raise awareness and sort of do a fact finding or impression finding search for what people in the industry themselves are going to
Yeah, what
feel as
concerns are that they need to consider when
right.
evaluating the acquisition for its anti-competitiveness or
Right.
um,
Which is it's actually a brilliant move on their part, the questionnaire aspect that the EU is doing. This is the EU is going to be giving a questionnaire to, or has given a questionnaire
yeah, and
to
actually has expected
developers.
returns at this point. So
Yep, and they're doing that as like my understanding. My guess is that they're not industry experts, so they're asking the industry experts
yeah.
for their input, which is great. Anyway, that's the second topic. We'll get to that. Justin, what's the third one?
Yeah, the middle topic that we're going to cover is on Meta, the formerly known as Facebook.
Yeah.
Uh, they finally announced the Quest Pro, which is a headset that is largely based off of the Quest 2, but with significant improvements. The improvements themselves, I think, are not that interesting. It's not the the position of the headset is in a very strange spot, and it's still going to have its own set of hardware built into the goggles that allow it to run games and apps. But it's more about the sensors and what they're trying to be able, what they're attempting to capture from the user. That is probably the most interesting and probably diverges the most from companies like Sony or HTC, where I guess like whatever Valve's doing. So kind of they kind of show what it is that they think is most important to their business, what Meta's future is, and kind of the future of the metaverse. So we'll talk about that at some depth to talk about like what their strategy might mean and where their focus is being turned to. We also had a pretty good breakdown by John Carmack, former owner of id Software. I don't know if he's still in any way.
I think company. I don't. He might have stock.
I mean, it was sold to Bethesda quite a long time ago, and I think he just probably got paid out. And
yeah, he was the lead programmer on games like Wolfenstein and Doom, Quake. The original Doom 2, Quake, all the way up at least through Doom 3, and I think Rage, or whatever that game was. Yeah, Rage.
Rage, yeah. Yeah. Cool. So we'll cover those topics. So let's just jump right into it. Also, if you do like this content, please like our videos, please.
There's a bell.
Yeah.
Somewhere.
There's a bell somewhere. There's a like button somewhere. I could say like and subscribe, but just if you like the videos, it does help boost the content. So let's get on with it. Eric, do you want to cover the first topic?
Yeah, sure. Let's dive right on in. So as part of I think it's the Brazilian regulators who are looking at the deal, the Microsoft Activision Blizzard buyout deal, required that Microsoft file a bunch of papers to show that this was not going to be a problem for competition in the marketplace. Amongst the papers that Microsoft and the evidence, whatever the paperwork Microsoft filed with them, was a statement of sort of income generated in certain market segments for them. And one of them was the what's it called? The GamePass, for the console Game Pass market. So Game Pass itself as a service is available in console, PC, and presumably in both. There's like this ultimate tier where you get access.
And plus, like non-PC, it's like mobile, I guess, but there is a non-PC, non-console version of it that is basically the cloud version that is also.
I think that's been rolled into that used to be like their xCloud option. I think that's been rolled into their ultimate tier at this point.
Yes, you can get the ultimate tier, but they've been able to figure out how to segment it out by people who are subscribing via and playing via Xbox, and the ones that are doing it via PC and everything else. So yeah,
right.
It's I'm assuming it excluding those in some metric that they've been able to figure out.
Yep. Now this is significant because Microsoft had, since the Xbox One days, stopped announcing any details about console sales or Xbox Live subscriptions. They basically just lumped everything into one Xbox games umbrella and said, here's what our money was. And the industry take on that was, wow, they're not selling anywhere near as much as they expected, and this is causing a problem for them potentially. In the news headlines, if it's like Microsoft sells 30% or is being outsold by Sony by 200%, something like that, and they don't want to give any fuel to the competition in the marketing domain. So they sort of dial back on what they had been announcing, only went into what was like the bare minimum for what's legally required for SEC filing and investor, relations. Yeah. And public announcements about, they're a publicly traded company, so they have to have some measure of, of transparency with what they're doing. For a long time, it had been Xbox games, as an umbrella, and then anyone else who had market data about this was generally looking at it by saying, okay, what are, say, the big box stores like Walmart and Best Buy? How are they reporting sales of consoles? Can we extrapolate that out and sort of say Microsoft is probably selling on the order of this many Xbox Ones? And that was always a big asterisk in there. Microsoft still doesn't announce their console hardware sales numbers. They still don't announce their subscription counts and services, although it might be changing slightly because Microsoft did, as part of this, this year announced that they have 25 million active subscribers in Game Pass. Now, that's across all tiers, probably across both console and PC segments. But there was one publication that looked at it a year ago, January, so January 2021. Microsoft's 25 million number was from January 2022, and that number was different by about 7 million. So Microsoft has increased their, I think I did the calculation, it's over 33% or something. It's some very large number. It's definitely over 33% of boost in subscribership year over year, which is huge. And they're making quite a bit of money on that, in the billions. The announcement from the Brazilian regulation review process was, this is the whole, like, Microsoft says the numbers that they've, Game Pass for consoles alone has generated 2.9 billion in gross revenue for the Xbox division in 2021. That was pre the numbers that they announced in 2022. Their fiscal year, by the way, ends at the end of June. So even if that was fiscal year 2021 for them, that would have been all the way through the end of June 2021.
Right. Which is probably the most accurate reporting we're going to get for some time in that. What's interesting there is that the numbers that they're reporting and what people are sussing out would indicate that every single Xbox Series owner would have Game Pass, which honestly isn't that surprising given that every Game Pass or every Xbox Series console is coming with a certain amount of time of free Game Pass. And this is something that we also don't know, is how many of these subscribers are on a free trial that, when it lapses, it means that they're likely to jump back off of it. This is also combined by, I think, a reported shrink in their what was it, their 2021 report. One of their claims after they showed a shrink in their games and services was that it was due to lack of subscriptions or fall in subscriptions and console sales. So while this number is telling, I'm not sure it still doesn't give us the full picture, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It just gives us a bit more of the picture than we've been able to get from Microsoft directly, like straight from the horse's mouth.
Right, and the interesting thing here is that you can look at it's a number in gross revenue that you can tie to I think an estimated number of total subscribers for that period. And the reason that that's somewhat interesting is because it will tell you what roughly the average user is spending on Game Pass. Or it could potentially, well, maybe. Again, this is that 2.9 billion is just for console, and I think the 15 to 18 million is across all, so it's not really something you can exactly take a ratio from. But it does give you a sense of where they fall into that. The other challenge here or the other thing to keep in mind is that Microsoft sells tiers of Game Pass. It's not like there's the Game Pass and it's this much money and it's just an easy division of subscribers divided by, or you can just figure out how much they make by multiplying subscribers by that number. Game Pass Ultimate is a thing that includes streaming of games and a bunch of other nice-to-haves benefits. There is also the base tier, which is effectively the same as original Xbox Live, which is the paid service that Microsoft requires for you to play most online games. There are some free-to-play games where I think the third party takes it upon themselves.
I did think Game Pass, because there is still Xbox Live Gold, unless they sunset.
That's been subsumed into Game Pass base tier. Okay.
I knew they were planning on doing it. I wasn't sure. It wasn't that long ago because they were still counting Xbox Live Gold amounts not that long ago. So yeah. All right. So then there's now at least 3 tiers then there, because there's Game Pass base, Game Pass, which includes the streaming of game, or the access to games, which is generally Microsoft published and a handful of partners, and then Game Pass Ultimate, which also allows cloud streaming of those games.
You know what? I just looked. I have to take it back. I was wrong. Maybe I was just thinking about your statement of like, I think they mentioned they were going to do that. Made me rethink it. There are tiers of Game Pass that include Xbox Live.
Yeah,
Microsoft
so they
does
still
sell.
They still have
Yeah.
Gold, which is weird because the
It's like
only
a separate
functional
$10.
value of it is it gives you online access to their games, and
Yeah.
they have been including 2 games per
Free
month,
game.
but the games that they've been including have been quite bad. So it's been deprioritized. I wouldn't be surprised if they then merge it. So then there are only 2 tiers of Game Pass, then, right?
That I'm not sure of. I know that all their marketing shows, Game Pass Ultimate. Because right now you can get a $1. You pay $1 for your first month or something like that. Yeah, and you can get just you get all the features of Game Pass, but they don't. Just on their website right now. Oh yeah, there's Game Pass for console, PC Game Pass, and Game Pass Ultimate. So there's those three tiers.
I actually, that makes sense. They have to split up the console and PC because the games that are available on Game Pass for PC are different than the ones that are available on console, since people are still making console-only games that eventually make their way to PC, etc. So, I did want to compare this to Sony's reported. I think they report 42 million PlayStation Plus subscribers.
Yep.
Much like, I think the difference is that PlayStation Plus now is a merged service. I think kind of in line with what you were saying about what Game Pass was, is that there's no longer the PlayStation Plus as a whole, like the base tier is you get access to online and 2 free games per month, and then there's tiers above that allow you to do access to games for free, or within the package, and then streaming on the top tier, which allows you to play it on a tablet or whatever. So that's kind of more in line with that. PlayStation has 42 million of them. I think their last reported division, their PlayStation division, reported 26 billion in sales in a given year. I think it was 2021 last reported year. So that's something to compare with. You can find out Microsoft's game division. The problem with their game division right now is that it's reporting an overall loss. Or it's not an overall loss, but the amount of money you see them making is hard to track because they've been making so many purchases that are not paying back yet. That if they were to buy, if the deal were to go through with Activision tomorrow, they'd be out $69 billion, and Activision's generating in net whatever it is, $8 billion a year or something like that. So. That's the sort of loss that you'd see in the reporting. And in 2021, they, I think, brought there was about 4 or 5 different mergers that they were paying a good amount, including Bethesda, that just throws off their games division performance pretty badly. So you can't get an accurate read of what Microsoft games and services actually looks like in terms of revenue performance because of all these mergers and acquisitions they're making.
Yeah, and the fun part is that depending on how they simmer their books, let's say, you might have ripple effects for years about this, where they carry forward loss via amortization of something, and say
cut into R&D or whatever else, or
right. Yeah. Oh, we had another negative year, so we don't owe taxes, and it's all because they may pull in 20 billion in a year, but they're out 69 billion in 1 year, so their profits are negative 49 billion dollars, which is we're going to carry that over to recoup our the liability stuff. That's things that you can do in business, is take loss and
assuming you have different revenue streams. Yeah, you can have loss against one group and then apply it to the other, or use the profits of another to write it off, which is exactly what Microsoft has been doing. Microsoft can do these enormous acquisitions because they're basically using Microsoft Office money and their enterprise software to write off the purchase of Activision and Bethesda in like basically less than a year's time.
Yeah.
And not only that, also take a really slim margin on the sale of every Xbox, which I even like 2 years in, I think they're still on a fairly hairline margin with how much they're making on each console sold.
Yep. So just for clarification, I did look into the Xbox Live versus Xbox Game Pass, and they did say that there's a Game Pass for console as one tier, $9.99 per month. Game Pass for PC was $9.99 per month. Game Pass Ultimate, which is $14.99 per month, and Game Pass Ultimate includes Xbox Live Gold. Xbox Live Gold by itself is $9.99 per month. So you save $5 if you're going to do Xbox Game Pass for PC or console and Live. Just get the Ultimate, and you get a bunch more nice little things. But yeah, it's interesting because Microsoft has branded Xbox Game Pass for console, and that may be specifically that tier is what Microsoft is suggesting they're making $2.9 billion on.
Yeah. Another interesting point to this is that so this data was provided mostly because Sony was making a heavy push to say Call of Duty is too important of a title, and it's an argument the regulators said as well, that like it's too heavy of a title to have it locked up behind one company. Microsoft argument was, hey, it doesn't make any fiscal sense for us to make Call of Duty exclusive to the Xbox. And I would put a caveat next to that, which is for like Call of Duty Online, the individual sales of like Call of Duty, whatever, Modern Warfare X, that may not necessarily be true. And they are coy enough with their wording that it's not to say that like none of like we will never or we'll always put every Call of Duty on cross-platform. I think specifically with the games that like MAU, monthly active users, is most important, like Call of Duty Warzone. Those games will probably remain that way until they hit an amount of monthly active users on their own services where they may feel comfortable removing it from, say, PlayStation. But more so, like Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, and like the ones in the regular installments, there's like a 3-year commitment to Sony that they have to uphold anyways because they're contracts that were signed before the merger was agreed to, or the acquisition was agreed to. We're not. What I'd say is like they are not obligated to keep doing that, and they have less of incentive to keep doing that. But they'd still have Call of Duty on PlayStation as long as Warzone's there, and the other like yearly installations are not after the contract with Sony's done. So, like that was the argument that Sony was making. This data that they provided for the Brazilian authorities or regulators was to combat that, to be like, look, we're not as large as you think. Sony is making so much more right now with their subscribership, and like, look, we're not as big and bad as you think we are. But and that argument, I guess, worked because the Brazilian authorities this week were basically like, you're greenlit to go. So
yeah, that in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, which is, I think, there's basically the way this whole process works for anybody aware or wants to know. There's basically any large international company purchase like this, it has to go by, I think, 5 different regulatory bodies in different countries, which is typically US, EU, UK, which we'll talk about later, and then you have a couple others. In this case, it's Brazil, and I think there's Saudi Arabia was the other one, which I think I have large enough, or Xbox, PlayStation have large enough footprints there where it was, important for the regulators to weigh in. And I think the EU, UK, and US still haven't finished their reviews, as far as I know. I don't think the US has given a go yet.
Right. So there are 42 million PlayStation Plus subscribers. If we assume that they're at what, $10 a month?
No,
that's $5 a month. Yeah, it's like it's $60 for a year, so $5 a month.
on a good day. So like, I think it's probably closer to like $40 or $50 per month is what it is, and that's US. I don't know what it's priced at around the world. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's not going to be. It's 42 million times $60 in a year as a minimum. Yeah, I guess that's 2.5 billion. Is what they would be pulling in. Microsoft or Sony would be pulling in for that.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's comparable, including
Right.
that Game Pass is now like in like year 3 of like their actual large push. It's been around longer than 3 years, but it was in like a beta form. So
Yeah.
it's actually quite impressive to see their numbers up that high at this point.
Yep.
All right, well let's move on to the next topic, Meta. I guess I can go over this, but I think you may have some important details that I might be missing. But
Sure.
yeah, so the next topic is Meta finally announced their Quest Pro.
Yeah. Headset.
Yes,
VR headset.
it's a VR headset, as all Quests. It used to be called the Oculus Quest, I believe, was their first iteration.
I think that was the Oculus Quest was number 1, and they rebranded.
Yeah, they rebranded when basically Facebook was like, we're Meta now. So yeah, it went to Meta Quest 2, which was I think launched 2 or 3 years ago at this point. And there's been these rumors swirling around, especially since Sony has been made known they were doing the Sony PSVR 2. I think both at the same time we started to get rumors of both of them that there's going to be a new headset. Both are kind of more consumer focused than most other headsets. So I think that's why they're in competition with each other, at least with the rumors. We know the full set of PSVR details, and we didn't know what Meta was proposing or even what price points they were planning on coming in at.
Mm-hmm.
And we got a full reveal at Meta's
Connect.
Yeah, Connect. I think so. It's their developer showcase, which is
Right.
let developers in on what they're doing. So we got the full details at that point. The first and very important detail is the price point. The Quest 2 originally came in at $299 at the base version. They've recently bumped the base version price up to $399, but it's very consumer friendly. Hardware is built into the lenses or the headset itself, so you didn't need any accompanying computer or anything like that. So it's
No
probably
cord hanging off.
Yeah, unless you want to connect it to a computer, because it does function as like a VR headset for PC.
The display, yeah.
But yeah, like it was very competitively priced for a consumer VR headset, and I think it found a lot of popularity in that. The new headset, the Pro, is priced at $1499, so much higher than the consumer space one, which I think on its own is pretty clear indication that they are not aiming at a consumer friendly solution there.
Yeah.
Other than that, we got like the specs ish. I don't think I could find a place where we actually found the clock frequency speeds, but what we did find out is they're using a pretty good lens type. Instead of using a Fresnel lens, which is what most headsets have used, they're using a pancake lens. I think there's less distortion in the pancake lenses than there are in the Fresnel. There's higher pixel density in the screens, although I don't have the exact pixel density rates or how much of an improvement they are over what the Quest 2 was.
They shared the resolution, but like almost no one reported about it. I don't think many people really cared about that number because it's still not as high res as a lot of people want it to be.
Yeah.
But it is higher res than the Quest 2, as I understand it.
Yeah,
like
probably below what the PlayStation VR 2 is at by a good amount.
Pretty sure that the numbers I saw were below.
Yeah.
As I recall. I could be off. I don't know.
Yeah, so then we also have the processor itself is the same core as the Quest 2, but they made it so there's more thermal space for the CPU to operate, or like the SoC to operate. And as a result, they're able to achieve 50% higher clock frequencies. It's also, we see improvement in memory speed, memory amount, and what was the other key piece there?
Let's see. You talked about
His memory access rates and the memory.
The total memory is increased.
Yes. So presumably they have to do this anyways, and they have to improve the clock speeds to basically support higher resolutions, and they're really trying to get the performance to lock at 90 frames per second, which I guess the past VR games really have not done a good job at locking in a 90 frames per second speed, and that makes for a pretty bad experience if you're like me, sensitive to motion sickness, where you have like fluctuating frame rates can make it kind of jarring as the speed lags behind your ability to turn your head.
Yeah, your eyes just move.
Yeah. So that's I think kind of like the aim here is that the overhead that they're giving it is really not to necessarily in graphic performance, but more in achieving targeted frame rates more consistently than they have before.
Yeah.
And at the resolutions now, so that with a resolution bump, it's to be able to achieve it for those resolutions.
The resolution, by the way, is 1800 by 1920.
There we go. Yeah. So
LCD. It's also not an OLED panel, as some in the past have been.
Yes, which isn't surprising because it's expensive, and it's not as surprising that Sony would do it because Sony's been kind of pioneering in that space, anyways. We still don't know Sony's price at that, so it could come in at $1,500. Who knows? Some of the more interesting details is there's color pass-through camera. They had cameras on the front of the original Quest 2, but they're black and white cameras, so when you would ever need to do a pass-through specifically for like finding the boundaries of your space or seeing where your hands are, it came in black and white. Now it's color, and this goes to a new strategy for them where they're pushing on this mixed reality aspect of it. So they have these shutters on the side of the goggles that can open up and give you peripheral view, which you couldn't get in the Quest 2. Plus the pass-through to make it like a augmented reality type experience where you're viewing real life. You have your peripheral views, but they can show overlaid VR on top of it. So, new direction. This is something that they didn't do with Quest 2 at all, nor did they actually promote it, but this is something that they're actually promoting with the Quest Pro. So that's most of the important like tech details. Now we have the sensor capabilities, which I think are kind of the more interesting aspect of all this. The sensors on the Quest 2 kind of promote expression more than anything else. So they have cameras that now can view and track your facial movements, so they can be transcribed and brought into a virtual avatar of your own. Eye tracking, which comes in handy for two major things, which is foveated rendering, which allows you to selectively choose where you render and achieve higher graphic fidelity, because you can use LOD in very specific ways. It also allows eye tracking in the avatar as well, so you can actually have an avatar lock eyes with you, and it shouldn't be that weird. Because
you're not just staring straight ahead and you have to rotate your head.
Not only that, but they emulate that sort of thing in games where like you have two virtual avatars and the avatar will lock eyes with you, kind of like in a NPC that will follow you around with their eyes or head tracking. But all that stuff was not actually what the person was doing. Now eye lock and head movements can be mapped one-to-one to what the person has the headset on, and being able to express their eyes and mouth more realistically than they could before. On top of this, we have the capabilities of the controller. It's more in line with what Sony's doing, so improvements in haptics, improvements in touch, or like what mimics your hand movements. So there's touch pads on the trigger and I think on the thumb button, which allows you to pinch in real time. But what it allows you to do is to like it will actually track your hand position to some degree. Usually, it's kind of like the marionette style, which is these are articulated and these are widely articulated, but you don't get full finger movement. Yeah, I think theirs is this, whereas I think Sony's actually is this too. Like you get the pinchy movement, but not the each digit moving
Yeah,
independently.
I think the earlier versions of Quest, like the original Quest, it was you had the finger. That was the extent of it. You might have if you pushed a button, like your thumb would do that, but it wasn't a pinch. It was like
Yeah,
yeah,
which is
weird.
kind of robotic and weird. So now you have a more of an analog movement mapped to your finger movements. Um,
It and it does still look a little weird. The we'll probably get into this in a little bit, but John Carmack gave a Carmack uncensored or unscripted, not
unscripted,
uncensored,
yeah.
unscripted, yeah, talk, and he was wearing the Quest Pro, and he was just giving this like he had a list of bullet point topics he wanted to cover, and he was just riffing on them. And if you sat there, it was this torso and a head talking in this room, and it had he was doing like finger guns everywhere.
Yeah,
just
he's like,
you just be pointing and moving your hands around.
Yeah.
You're doing this, and it was like that's so awkward for an hour. It was like an hour of that
of like a ghostly body, head
yeah
and torso floating around and just finger gunning.
yeah.
So, but it was actually was a good display of what the like what it seems Meta is attempting to do here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the other important information about the controller is it no longer is just the headset that's tracking it. As you mentioned to me earlier, just before this, it now allows you to track behind head. I'm not entirely sure how they do that.
That's the sensors are built into the. I think it does. I don't know. My guess is that it does some sort of room tracking on and along with gyroscopes to see where things, how its perception of the world changes based on motion.
Yeah.
But you know, you move it. The big thing is that before with Quest 1 and 2, it would be the sensors looking down at the controllers in your hands, tracking that way, and it could say like, okay, you moved it forward or moved it up and down. But if you did this, it would lose tracking. Now
it might be
that
a case of
work.
that they didn't have cameras like in peripheral mode that allowed you to track behind hand, like up to this point where your hands could go far behind your head.
They might have. It certainly didn't behind the back, so you couldn't like put your hands behind your back and do stuff with that. It would just break.
Yeah, and actually the same thing with the PSVR 1, which actually didn't use head tracking. It used the sensor bar. So basically, if your body obscured the sensor, your hand would disappear. Now, these things aren't huge problems for a personal experience, but again, this goes back to for other people who are looking at you and watching your virtual avatar, these things become quite important because it gets rid of some of the jankiness that these have experienced in the past. Also, improved haptics. So I think a HD rumble type haptics that you get, similar to what the PlayStation, what is it called?
DualSense?
DualSense, yeah. I was like, Sense. What is it? DualSense.
The double sense.
Yeah. So it's able to do what that does. So it's a very interesting play by them because I think what everybody was expecting was a more capable headset that was going to have richer fidelity. And I'm not sure that's exactly what the target is. And a lot of the discussion around this kind of indicates that while Facebook has enjoyed the popularity of as a gaming platform for like a consumer base, it doesn't exactly seem like that's what they care about the most in with this Pro headset. So do you want to talk a bit about this, Eric, and sort of how it might play into their strategy overall?
Yeah, so their overall strategy seems to be one of right now they're focused on with the Pro at least nailing the sense of being in a room with another person, and that's not a game related thing so much. That's more of a interpersonal, we need to be productive sort of thing, and productive as humans. Like you could claim that being in a chat room with friends and being able to see them smile and do that stuff is productive to a sense, but it's not necessarily going to drive the meat of the value, I should say, the value proposition for the experience. Typically, if you're hanging out with friends in a chat room, you're probably playing a game or just shooting the breeze and looking at the cool space that you're in 3D, and or watching a movie in shared virtual environment. Fine. Not Microsoft, Meta is looking to make sure that people who are in a shared meeting room can properly signal to each other using standard human, well-known, like built-in gestures. That's right. Being able to like wink, gaze, like if you look down or look off to the side, that indicates something. And that has historically not been something that VR has communicated through that space. This headset also has the color see-through, lets you, or pass through, I should say, lets you do more AR stuff and lets you kind of see the world you're in if you need to look at something. The ability to optionally block out the light with the shades that they can attach on it, or take them off so you can see through the peripherals and through below. I believe it also mentioned through below, let you, look at your keyboard or something if you're typing into, in your virtual screen. There's a whole lot of this. It's built for Meta's business stuff. And that comes through in a few other announcements that they made. It's one of them is that they have the final experience. They showed off a few experiences that were sort of game-like. And then the last one, their like big reveal, was something, I think it was called like Meta Meeting Room or something like that. It was something very bland. And apparently, according to the journalists who were there to report on it, very underwhelming. Workrooms, yes, thank you. And Meta Horizon Workrooms. Horizon is their like metaverse space that they're trying to build,
because they have Horizon Worlds.
Home.
Yeah.
We just said the two that they have, Home and Worlds, and now they have Workrooms, and that was their new thing. And people were apparently very underwhelmed at the announcement because it was sort of like they recreated a corporate like office, like a meeting room with like a nice view looking out the window.
Like, which I think says a lot about what their overall strategy is, right? Like, and there's actually, right, because from our perspective, it's games, right? Like, the metaverse is going to be led by games. I think you and I share the same belief that all these attempts at doing the metaverse that are like purely from the ground up are not necessarily exceeding anybody's expectations. And the reality of it is that like the metaverse is more likely to come from the expansion of a like live service type game like Fortnite or Roblox or something of that nature. And so, Facebook's attempt is basically saying, we just want a social meeting space. Like, this is what's important to us, is track users on an online space, create utility for companies like that want to have virtual workrooms and virtual workspaces, and people who want to host events like like having like a virtual conference, like the one we didn't do Sonic Boom Live at the past couple weeks because we were at MetaBeat, and MetaBeat started with the first day being in a meta space, which I don't know how successful that was, nor am I going to really comment on it, but like that's what Facebook is saying, hey, we can make a play here.
Right. And that's backed up by the further news that came out during this, which is that Meta is partnering with Microsoft in this space. And Satya Nadella and Mark Zuckerberg were interviewed by some people about this. They had the announcement. I think they were supposed to play a game of Beat Saber against each other as part of this announcement or something. Oh no, that was John Carmack and Mark Zuckerberg. But they were supposed to do something. I think they might have met up in the workroom space or whatever. Yeah. At any rate, whatever happened, Microsoft is really pushing right now for Microsoft Teams to be effectively a software layer that works on top of the MetaQuest Pro. And for Microsoft Teams, they're sort of seeing this as a operating system for business interactions. And that's their big push. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to take over Slack, of course, and Discord and all the other chat programs. And if they can, their partnership with Meta is very much big corporate, massive corporate entities who are also the companies that are fighting against allowing people to remain remote, maybe this is a solution for you where you can have, not only can you have remote, certain employees work remotely, but you could have two separate teams in two separate buildings on the other side of the world talk to each other, but feel like they're in the same space.
Right.
And to an extent, some of the reporting that we've seen has said that people who have tried that experience were sold on it. Like they put on the headset, they were in the room, and they sort of, the fact that one person was in New York and the other person was in Burlingame, California, disappeared. That distance was not a factor. They were actually able to see them and sort of start interacting to them as though it were an in-person meeting, which is sort of the promise. That's what they were going for. At the same time, they were also hitting, the journalists couldn't forget to mention that, or couldn't neglect to mention that there were certain drawbacks that were like, okay, this is clearly not actually in person, and here's some issues we ran into during this experience. But they could see that was the experience that they were going for. So it's sort of weird the way that Meta has been positioning this in terms of like who they're communicating to with these events, how they're bundling them, because a lot of this stuff is still like they showed games. I think my understanding is that they showed games during this, and they're like, but why don't you just come out and show the corporate stuff? And also, why do you, if the whole thing about the metaverse is you can do anything, like why don't you break the walls and show that you can morph the space? Why show off a replication of of the simplest possible room to build, which is like corporate boardroom or whatever. So boring, but that's what they did. And I guess maybe that's working for them, because it certainly has gotten them lots of journal news articles written.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just like, I think a lot of people, myself included, as I just said, is that I think the metaverse will come out of gaming because it's like fundamentally a gaming space. But I think this shows like a market, like someone at Facebook's like, there's actually a business opportunity in social interactions in a virtual space, and we have a primed, marketplace for this now that companies are being forced to go virtual in a lot of ways since the pandemic. This is our opportunity. And I think with the Pro, they're just like, our consumer is not the gamer at this point in time, because the hardware itself in the headset is not gaming focused, and like it would be hard pressed to find like a gamer who'd be like, I'm willing to spend $1,500 on the Quest Pro when I could spend less money on Valve's option or any of these other high-end headsets that now they have to get paired with a PC and everything, but they make for a much better gaming experience than they do for like here's something that can be packaged and mass sold to large companies who want to virtualize their teams. And I think the issue here is that their mixed messaging is like, oh, we're a gaming platform, and we're going to name it after the game platform, but we're not actually caring about games with this. And a lot of the conversation around this was more about how do we interact with each other in virtual spaces and make it feel more natural. And that's how they kind of solve the problems around that. I don't think it's a bad strategy for them. I think it's just weird because of all the mixed messaging and what I think people were really expecting from them.
I think the more compelling story in terms of the metaverse so Meta keeps trying to push this metaverse. They have Horizon Worlds, Horizon Home, Horizon Workrooms. And according to reports, I've never played it myself or played with those or entered or experienced them. But according to reports and even videos you can find online, it's pretty boring and drab and bland. And then you go in and look at what other options are available. You have Roblox, which is, may not be graphically the most amazing looking thing, but it certainly is lively. And there's lots of fun experiences that you can have in there, especially if you're a kid, which is who that's targeted at. If you're not a kid, probably don't want to go there. But instead, you could check out VR Chat, which is this other service that is available to Quest players or Quest users, and is effectively possibly the closest thing to what we all sort of collectively imagine, or thanks to popular media like movies and books, what the metaverse will be. this is probably the closest thing, because people just go in using the Unity game engine, build a bunch of stuff, and invite people in to check it out. Then there's rampant copyright infringement happening because no one's checking that, and people are just like, look, I built a Pokemon town. You can come in and check out my Pokemon town. It has all the characters you know. Nintendo had nothing to do with this. It's not sanctioned or anything, but you can go do it. And there are oddities about that space, just in terms of interactions that happen, but at the same time, it has a crazy wild array of experiences that you can have, which is not at all the case with the Horizon stuff, as far as I'm aware, as far as I've found.
Yeah, I mean, like, the whole thing is that, hey, chat rooms are part of the reason why the internet was successful. You're like, yeah, because it connected people together, but there was no barrier of entry, really. Not one that included a $300 to $1,500 cost, and I think that's the thing that may be missing here. Is like, I don't think they're wrong looking at it and going, hey, people want to socially interact in meaningful ways in a virtual environment. But we're going to sell to corporations, because who wants to be in this space except for people who are paid to? And that's the thing that's like, I'm not sure if this is the right approach, but I guess if they can be paid to solve the more complicated problems of how to create a meaningful interaction virtually by having hardware on your face and on your body or on your hands that allow you to gesture in real time in a way that seems more meaningful, then maybe this is the best way for us to get there. Because from the gaming side of things, at least as of right now, the bigger pushes graphic fidelity in interesting experiences, not so much the social interaction aspect.
Yeah, we're still on the technical side, figuring out problems like, how the heck do you hit 120, frames per second, or 90 even?
Yeah, with graphic fidelity.
Right, but also the fact that, games are what's known as double buffered, typically triple buffered for console games if they can get away with it and not feel laggy. But double buffered means you have 2 frames in process at once graphically, and it's there's a latency. If you're at 60 frames per second, you're at 16 milliseconds per frame. You have 32 milliseconds per built-in latency before the input of the state of your buttons cause the image that you're about to see to be rendered. So you have that huge that 32 milliseconds of latency is massive, and it's like 30 frames per second or something like that, roughly. Equates to is in terms of the latency, not at the actual refresh rate. So that's way below what is comfortable in VR for many people. Like 90 hertz is really the goal, 75 minimum. And you're talking about, how do you keep moving with the modern best practices for how to present something to the screen for the user, hit frame target, and also adapt. Even if you're getting down to the sub 10 milliseconds per frame or sub that, there's still the question of for head tracking. If your head was here and it started to create the frame and it said, okay, they're looking in this direction while you're turning your head, it's going to be late. Even by a few milliseconds, it's going to add up and things will feel a little sluggish. So there are tricks that people are pulling nowadays to sort of slide your view a little bit and skew things a bit. And when your head steadies, it evens out. But this is all stuff that we're figuring out how to do to try to accommodate things like rapid eye movement. If you're shifting your vision over to the side or something suddenly, that all happens extremely fast. And we're trying, there are hardware limitations that we're figuring out workarounds for to get this stuff to work. So there's all these very, very low level details that are being hammered out right now. And it seems like Meta has decided, we also want to make sure that we're not just focusing on the fidelity and that timing, but we're also making sure that we're getting face tracking, mouth tracking, expression tracking working.
And it's also probably a seeding to the game industry that says, we're not going to be able to compete with the PSVR that has a PlayStation console attached to it. So why compete there when we could find a new space? And that seems to be what they've kind of gone with there. All right,
All
well, let's
right.
move on to the last topic, which probably is why a lot of people were here. This is on on the topic of the UK and EU regulators probably mounting the strongest defense against the Xbox Activision Blizzard acquisition, which has been going through the paces. If you were here, I don't know, an hour ago, when we were talking about PSVR, or excuse me, when we were talking about the first topic, which was Xbox revealing some of its Game Pass numbers. This is all in relation to regulators going through the pacing to determine whether or not what Microsoft is doing through the Activision purchase is anti-competitive, monopolistic, and would require some sort of regulation on how they're doing it. This has been that 5 different countries or regions are taking their own regulators and determining whether or not there is need for regulation on this acquisition. So we've gone over this before in past episodes as well. But now the EU is coming in line with like their final decision. So we have a bit to discuss there. And UK is now stepping up and actually kind of waving a flag as it stands, saying we're not quite as comfortable with this as, say, Saudi Arabia and Brazil, who have just approved it. Do you want to go over the details here, Eric?
Yeah, sure. So the EU body basically came forward and said, we're going to be sending out a questionnaire. This is, earlier in the year, to game developers and folks in the game industry, across the game industry, to get their impression on what's going on. Please provide us with feedback. I think the questionnaire had something like 100 questions on it. And they needed the questions back by October 10th, and that they will make a final decision by November 8th. This presumably is to allow them to get industry expert input and guidance on the topic, because you can't assume that there are going to be game industry professionals in this specific body. Not everyone is going to have a great insight and understanding as to how the game industry works overall.
Yeah,
that's sort of the point. But excuse me. Also, more recently, the UK, they have a body called the CMA, which is the Competition and Markets Authority. The CMA has looked into this, and they're also pretty traditionally hesitant about sort of big deals and what their effect may be on anti-competitiveness.
Yeah, the EU and UK in general are a bit more conservative with what they consider, or not conservative, because it depends on how you use it at this point. But they are more thorough and conservative in their rulings to determine like whether or not it's anti-competitive. They're more likely to slap a regulator with something that says, hey, this business behavior hasn't been great. You've seen this with the way that they've tackled like social media and their access to users' information, internet as well, where
Google.
Yeah, exactly. Google and
right,
large companies like this being fined and being told that the way you're doing things has to be changed. Yep. So yeah, both these bodies are probably less likely to let things slide as easily as the Brazilian and Saudi Arabian authorities have. I think the U.S. is still yet to weigh in, but I haven't heard anything yet, so it's unclear where we're actually falling. The U.S. tends to be quite open to questionable mergers that make these like mega companies that challenge the traditional ideas of what monopolies were, or at least duopolies and whatnot.
In the last 20 or 30 years, especially, the U.S. has been very business friendly
since
on the global scale.
Like 80, late 70s, early 80s, when a certain president decided to upend a lot of that.
Yep. So. Yeah, good times. But the EU is definitely less big business friendly and are much more aggressive, as Justin was saying, about saying no in these circumstances, like big companies,
or at least pushing regulation.
Right. And in this case, the CMA put forth a statement where the CMA has found that the potential strategic benefits to Microsoft of using Activision Blizzard King's content to foreclose rivals, such as expanding the Game Pass user base and strengthening network effects in its gaming ecosystem, could outweigh any immediate losses in terms of licensing revenues. So, they're very clear about saying we are seeing that there's a huge, like as they put it, strategic benefit to this for Microsoft that could very much dramatically shift the playing field in their favor. At the to the deficit of basically everyone else in the market.
Yeah, and I also think this kind of says, hey, just because this costs a lot now, and you may not be in a position where this seems like a fiscally bad move, the long-term effects of this can't be outweighed by the basically short-term fiscal losses.
Right. And they also go on to say, or possibly in the initial summary, they have a statement where and this is important because it splits up the concerns that they have across three sort of sub-segments, which are pretty interesting. So the CMA sees, this is a quote, realistic prospect of a substantial lessening of competition, which substantial lessening of competition is, they abbreviate that as SLC, but whatever.
Which I think is the reason why they abbreviate it, because I think that's one of the factors in which they have to consider whether or not this is something that is impacted and whether or not it should be regulated.
Right. Yeah. As because again, they're against they're the body looking at competition in markets, and this would be a substantial lessening of that, which is bad according to that setup. So there's a realistic prospect of a substantial lessening of competition in gaming consoles, multi-game subscription services, and cloud gaming services. So they look at it from three separate angles. And in the article, or in the publication that they've put forth, their preliminary findings, it seems that they have serious concerns on all three of those fronts. Microsoft is effectively setting themselves up to crush competition, across gaming consoles, multi-game subscription services, and cloud gaming services.
Yeah,
which, like it's hard to fault them when you're looking at that, because they're absorbing what was one of the pillars of the competition in that space into themselves and subsuming it.
Yeah. I think this is probably the more accurate look at it, because I think Microsoft has so far been able to argue we're not the big guys in here. We're actually the small fish. Like Sony and Nintendo do significantly better than we do in digital sales and services, which is true, but it fails. It neglects to look at, like, if someone were to be able to get Game Pass on anything, including consoles, and you're able to play the latest games, what does that do to the way Sony currently makes money and other companies currently make money? Because it undermines that entirely. It says you don't have to make purchases anymore. You just subscribe to the service, and no longer do you make purchases. It's very analogous to what Netflix and streaming services has done to the DVD and Blu-ray sales, which have plummeted and to the point where stores won't even carry them anymore. So, it's not exactly a fair argument that Microsoft is making, going like, well, we're the small guys in here. It's like, no, your service as it stands is likely to disrupt the entire gaming landscape, and will crown a new king pretty rapidly once you see the outflow towards service like this. And with their ownership of such large publishing companies, there would just be it would be like Netflix buying Disney and like Fox and these companies before there were their own streaming services well ahead of time, making it so that they had 40% of all content that was created, at least at the high end of things, which would have made it very, very difficult for right now where we're at, where we have Paramount, Plus, and 5 or 6 different streaming services, major streaming services available.
Yeah, and there is a bit of that. What's happening here is what a lot of people were afraid of when Disney went out and bought Star Wars licenses, all of whatever Lucasfilm had, and Marvel. When those two were bought, it was suddenly like, whoa, that's so much IP that they've just absorbed. Like, what about anti-competition in that space? Disney still could point out and say, like, look, there's all these other movie and TV. Like, we're not buying all of them. There's a ton of that stuff, and which has borne out. I mean, Disney is very popular, and generally they have like their three pillars. They've got Disney classic stuff, or just Disney. Then they have, well, I guess they have National Geographic now as well, but like Disney, National Geographic, Star Wars, Marvel. But then everyone has like 6 or 7 streaming services, so it's not like they're the only ones in town, which is what seems like would happen with Microsoft here. The other aspect of what you were saying, Justin, in this case, is it's not just that Microsoft is saying like, oh yeah, we can buy all these this IP, and we're the biggest streaming service. It's also the fact that Microsoft has the infrastructure to run this on themselves internally. They don't have to pay fees that competitive fees that Sony would to have the cloud infrastructure backend to compete.
I think
Microsoft
has Sony is paying Microsoft for the cloud infrastructure to stream
to do their stuff, right? Yeah. So yeah, Microsoft or Sony, what we're talking about here is Microsoft Azure, which is a multi-continental, huge warehouses full of compute resources that Microsoft can throw at this and pay cost, for running the services, versus everyone else who has to pay cost plus, service contract fees, all the other stuff that they're, that you charge on top of just like how much did I have to pay my engineer and how much did I have to pay, the electric bill,
right?
So it would be more like Netflix already had its own content distribution network, like Akamai or Cloudflare, and then went out and bought all the content and said, you know what? We're going to put this all on a subscription service and make this incredible subscription service. And then no one could compete because they already own the distribution center to get the content streaming quickly. It's so that's where I think the UK's look at this and trying to break it up and say, wait. It's not just the games. Like, even if we allowed it, it's sort of anti-competitive already because of Microsoft's built-in diversity of their business. Yeah. It's so cross top to bottom, like across the board, that they own operating systems that run some of this stuff, or a lot of it. They own the cloud infrastructure and the back end stuff. They own the platforms. Now they're going to own all the IP.
Yeah.
Other companies will not have the ability to build that unless maybe Apple or Google steps in to do it. And if Meta got bored of the metaverse stuff that they're trying,
Yeah. And I think, like,
Amazon maybe.
Yeah, Amazon could potentially step in, and I think people who like are looking at this on like surface level and being like, "Hey, well, Sony buys plenty of companies, and why is that okay?" I would make a single argument here, which is, it's not necessarily the issue that Xbox is buying, these companies. It's that they're buying the IP and have full control over what happens to the IP afterwards. So in a case like, I don't know, Sony doing a Spider-Man game, they bought, Insomniac to sort of do this because they're kind of a powerhouse developing group, not with strong IP, but with strong development chops that could take a Sony license or a Spider-Man license and run with it. But at any time Marvel goes, hey, the contract's over, like Spider-Man doesn't follow the PlayStation at that point. It stays with Marvel, and Marvel can give it to someone else, and Sony still has Insomniac. And not only that, like the IPs that they've purchased are quite limited. It's more about them getting development talent that can make really excellent experiences, and then developing their own internal IP. So rarely is it the case where, oh, this is really great game that everybody loved on all consoles is now I have to buy a PlayStation in order to play that. Like, that's not the case. And I can actually only remember very few instances where that was. Whereas Microsoft has always had the strategy of buy popular IP. We can run the developer into the ground for all we care, but we want to buy the popular IP and secure it on our console, and then make it exclusive to it. Whether or not they do that with Call of Duty, I think is kind of moot. It's more like that they have the control and ability to do that, and they can do it with any number of Call of Duty IP as they see fit.
Yeah, the only game I can think where they've done that, or they've purchased studios in the past that have made their own IP and done that. But they haven't necessarily turned it into like a flagship Sony IP. And the only ones I can think where they sort of did do that were Sony had already been publisher on that, so they were second party games.
But yeah, right. They were Sony owned IP, like developed by another studio, and then they buy that studio to continue working on that IP,
developing it. Right. Yeah. And in a handful of cases, like with God of War, it was started by Sony Santa Monica. They built this, or they bought the studio and renamed it to be a Sony thing, and then started Sony IPs there. Like so.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is a very different strategy than what Microsoft typically has pursued, which is like, like, we love GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. Let's buy Rare. And then they buy Rare with their IP suite. Now, Rare is not the company that it was when they were developing those things, but that's the sort of thing that happens when they were buying the companies back in the Xbox 360 and Xbox original days.
Yeah, there's also an interesting sort of outlook on that because a lot of my own personal understanding, and this could be way off base, to be fair, is that a lot of what made Rare in the late 90s Rare was a very close connection to Nintendo and Nintendo's strict requirements and game design standards and all that other stuff. And then they hit Microsoft, and Microsoft's history of buying and nurturing studios has not necessarily been the best, especially in that era, early 2000s.
All the way up until now. They've not been able to really nurture anything out of their studios with the handful of maybe 2 or 3 prime studios that were.
Right.
They've probably purchased and shuttered more studios than any company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Things that were previously doing very well. Microsoft gets them and then says look, we're hands off now. It's all you guys. And whereas they had these studios had previous market pressures, like publishers saying, no, you have to hit this date. This isn't good enough. Go back into the drawing board, fix this. Like Microsoft, this is conjecture. Microsoft may have been oh no, you're good. We trust you. Something. Clearly, there was some change of direction that happened, and
it was the purchase of Mojang.
Apparently,
Mojang had a lot of strong words with how it was they were going to be managed, and given a lot of insight to how the current Microsoft or Xbox studios are being handled, which is give some creative freedom, give them the budget, and you can't base off the progress of progress of a game based off of early milestones, and asking people to produce, vertical slices and putting all the resources into that, and then expecting things to hit on time. So there's a bunch of stuff that have changed since, but I think that the fact remains that Xbox has had this strategy for a very long time where it's buy companies with IP that is popular and lock it down to your console, and this has continued to this day. And they might have even shot themselves in the foot with the purchase of Bethesda. Bethesda was a huge purchase for them that had 2 very, very successful IPs, not to mention a handful of pretty popular other ones. And then going, hey, don't worry about this. We're going to lock down these IPs for ourselves. We're still unclear whether or not Fallout will make it to other consoles at any point in time, but Starfield definitely is Xbox
exclusive.
Xbox, and GamePass and PC exclusive.
PC,
but it won't be making its way to PlayStation. So then, with the purchase of Activision Blizzard, everybody's looking at it with a side eye, going, you're not being very specific about what you mean by Call of Duty will be on other platforms for how long, and what does Call of Duty mean? Is it the live service? Is it the individual installments that we're getting on a couple of year basis? What does this actually mean? And they have no incentive to be clear about it until a regulator holds their feet to the fire and says, you have to be clear about it, because if not, we're not going to approve the purchase, and we're going to put regulations on how you're going to do things, or force you to do things a specific way.
Right, in order to sell into the market.
Yeah, or to make an acquisition with just hooks in the requirements to do so.
Right.
And I think they can compel them to be you have to the Call of Duty franchise has to be multi-platform.
I would not be surprised if there were bodies where they had to do that. I mean, it could be a thing where, if it's as small as the UK, then Microsoft might be able to say, like, fine, we'll just not sell Call of Duty at all in the UK.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and then UK players don't get to play with those because they couldn't live up to those standards. But the EU is a much bigger marketplace overall. So.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how they actually decide to go forward with this and whether or not the regulators there will do anything. I think that it will go through unless the US follows the EU's lead, and it's a toss-up because I think although our regulators in terms of anti-competitiveness tends to flow and be more political than we would probably want them to be. So depending on who is leading the country at the time, we see changes in the way our regulators treat these sort of acquisitions. So that being said, unless the U.S. does something, it's going to be interesting. I don't think this will stop the merger from happening or the acquisition from happening. It just may change the way, like, the rules in which they're able to do the acquisition, like what Call of Duty means and how it can be sold in the future may get regulated.
Yeah.
You have any other feelings on this before we go?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, I was just, myself glad to see the UK taking the approach that it did. I liked what the way the EU has handled it as well so far. I mean, clearly they haven't said anything, that their statements coming out in November, but the fact that they were, like, humble enough to say, you know what, we're going to survey the industry. What do people in the industry who are going to be affected by this actually think, and who have the actual understanding of what the impact may be for them?
Yeah.
And the industry, and, like, just the industry in general. And so that was very nice to see that they were going to try to get input. It'd be interesting to see what their findings were. But
which we should find out by early November, which is good.
Right. I am very much a fan of the sort of deliberate, well thought out approach that the UK seems to be taking to this, because it does highlight some of the concerns that I know that you and I have discussed in terms of, like, what is the possible impact of this, and, like, if Microsoft takes off, like, how is anyone going to catch up?
Yeah.
Like, it's there goes all the potential for competition, because right now Microsoft has, like, the platform and the backbone. They don't necessarily have the content, but they get that triumvirate, and it's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, I think we're also dealing with a much, much smaller IP pool than, like, even with video and film and TV.
Oh, yes.
Right? Like,
yes.
TV's got like 70 years of content.
I mean, you could argue that there are still thousands of games produced per year, and say, like, well, yeah, not all those are going to be on GamePass.
Not that many games that reach, like, the sort of heights that.
That's right. It's the quality, the cultural cachet, and the cultural impact. And the vast majority of revenue for the industry.
Yeah.
So
we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
I guess we'll have more on this probably in November when we get EU's ruling and their final statements on that, and then UK should be following shortly thereafter, and US may surprise us at some point because I think they're expecting a final verdict on this and for the deal to be approved by the end of the year. So that tells us that regulators should have something wrapped up, unless they get into some sort of
I think the UK's deadline was something like March 2023 for their final report, their final version. So there, some regulating body had some final date of March 2023.
Yeah.
So who knows?
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up for today. If you like this content, if you like what we talk about, please like and subscribe. It does help us out. It helps us to keep track of who's actually paying attention to this stuff.
Or how many people, and
Yeah. I still think maybe we should start putting this up on a podcast and see how that goes.
Yeah.
On the podcast services. But
yep.
Anyways, thanks everybody for watching it today. We had some pretty good viewership today, so it's good to see.
Cool.
We'll catch you again next week.